Hi there, my name is Iain Martin. I'm the Europe news editor with Forbes. I'm joined here today by Tony Jamous of Oyster and Godard Abel of G2. I think everyone in recent years has experienced issues with burnout, and the challenges facing everyone in business go ever harder, even more so for founders in a tough economy, in a difficult fundraising environment. So we're going to hear today from two founders who have consciously chosen a kind of a different path, or chosen to structure their business around priorities that are very important to them. So maybe start with sort of Tony. Can you maybe tell me about sort of how you chose to kind of set up Oyster based on kind of your experience with your previous companies and what you chose to prioritize with your business?
Sure. So Oyster is from the beginning is a globally distributed business. And why I wanted to build this distributed and flexible business, because I wanted work to work for me. I lived 25 years in London and San Francisco, in cities. I wanted to go away and live near nature, so I moved to the island of Cyprus. And I didn't want to sacrifice my life. I wanted to be ambitious, not only in business, but also in my personal life, in my relationship. I wanted to take care of myself. So I wanted to have a flexible setup that enables me to have the life I want to have. So at Oyster, we primarily work asynchronously. My team is distributed in 70 countries, and we have built an operating system that enables us to really manage ourselves as well, to be as productive as possible and as collaborative as possible. And that, essentially, it was a pretty selfish act, if you think about it. But I like to think about, as a leader, as self to be everybody. I thought I was the only one that was looking for flexibility, freedom of location, but actually, we all need that.
Very good. Godard, you've spoken before about how in your first business, you were kind of driven by fear and anxiety, and you were just telling me backstage how you fell asleep over your laptop at night. What have you learned, and how have you built G2? What have you done differently this time?
Yeah, in my first company, Big Machines, we started it in 2000, and then there was a big crash, the dot-com crash, which I actually think was even much more severe than the current downturn, and so I could no longer raise money, and pretty almost went bankrupt 3 years in. And also my dad was my first angel investor. I'd recruited my best friends from college, and so I just felt like I was failing everyone. I was failing myself, failing my friends who decided to work with me, failing my dad, failing my investors, and it felt very heavy for many years, and it was just a storm cloud of anxiety in my forehead, and all I could think about was work. And it did lead to even at night, I couldn't just stop working because I always felt like I needed to do more, but I'd just get so tired that it'd be 11 p.m. midnight, and I'd literally just pass out on my laptop, wouldn't even brush my teeth, and and then I was kind of doing a lot of that for many years, and then towards the end of my first company, eventually it did become successful. We ground through it. But it just felt horrible the whole way. There was always this storm cloud of fear, anxiety, and I could never, during that time, luckily my wife stayed with me. We had 3 young kids, but I remember I'd be with my kids, and also I couldn't really be present with them. It'd be Saturday morning, kind of my turn to be with the kids. My wife would go for a run, and I'd be in the basement with them, but then I'd fall asleep on the couch. And luckily they didn't stick their hand in the socket and die, but I just wasn't being my best self. I was also over 20 pounds heavier, drinking too much, eating too much. So I was just doing a lot of self-destructive things because I couldn't deal with the anxiety of my company.
Now, Tony, you recently raised, in the last year, 150 million rounds, and you've spoken about that kind of experience of that being very challenging. Can you maybe talk about that? I think you've defined that as being burnt out by that fundraising round.
Yeah, so while I thrive to maintain balanced work-life balance as much as I can, there's some period of time where it has to be a sprint, as we discussed earlier. And in fundraising mode, it was a 2-month sprint. We had to talk to 30 investors, or pitch them, multiple pitches. With my team, at the end of the process, after we closed the term sheet, it was actually for 17 months ago, it was really at the beginning of the cracks in the economy, we really burned out. I burned out, and I already had signs of burnout before, but I could not stop. I had to see it through, and So I went to my team, and we have a mental health challenge, a mental health channel at Slack in the company, and I said, like, guys, for everybody in the company, look, I'm burnout. Don't judge me for my behavior right now. I'm going to take 3 days off. I'm going to recharge, and I'll be back. And I was able to recover and come back to a more balanced and healthy work-life balance.
Is this an interesting concept? Like, are there sort of different seasons in sort of work and life? Like, sort of other times you kind of, even though as two founders who've kind of very consciously decided to maintain a balance, are there times that you kind of need to sprint? Or like, are there times you kind of have to choose a slower pace with work and like more balance? Like, Godard, what's your experience?
Yeah, no, and I think just to close the story in the first company, luckily at the end of that I met a conscious leadership coach, Jim Dethmer. And so then when I've started second and third companies, I've approached it very differently. Kind of like Tony, I said, hey, I also want to design the company and my work life so that one, I can be happy, I can feel more joy, and two, that will radiate through to my team, hopefully even my customers. But part of that is this idea of sprint and recover in different seasons. And right now, frankly, I'm in my kind of sprint season. Because every fall I do a world tour of global evangelism for G2. And I love it, but like right now I'm in the middle of the road, 2 weeks. Last week I was in Asia, this week I'm in Europe, and so I'm away from my family for 2 weeks. And frankly, also during the pandemic, I moved to Boulder to be next to the mountains, to be in nature, but I'm kind of away from all of that for 2 weeks, but it's kind of a very conscious choice where I'm like, hey, I'm gonna go really hard for 2 weeks, travel around the world. I still take an hour every day now to work out, meditate, take care of myself, so I keep some baseline level. But then when I get back to Colorado, I'll take 3 days, take those off, won't work, and just spend it in nature with family. And so I think this idea of just making more conscious choices, and at times, yes, I'm going to go all in, I'm going to work 16 hours today, but then other times saying, I'm going to take the time for myself, for my family, and recover.
I just want to add, like, this is like why we do this, right? Like why we seek for this work-life balance, because actually it's better for business. It's like very good for performance, financial performance, cultural engagement levels, retention, because people is going to look at you as a leader, as a role model, and see how are you taking care of yourself. And that's going to reflect of how you care for your people and care for the business. So I believe in this concept of what I call sustainable leadership, where you sustain yourself as a leader, you take care of your team and your business, and also you take care of your impact on the planet. And I think we are very much impacted on an unconscious level. We're seeing the environment around the natural environment being impacted by our actions and our footprints, and thriving to become a more sustainable leader is a source of productivity, performance, but also well-being.
That's very interesting. You're both founders of startups with a unicorn valuation. But I know from talking to many investors, when they hear that many investors could dismiss a business as a sort of where the founder is like explicitly setting boundaries as like, this is a lifestyle business that won't have a big outcome, that won't have high growth. Like, how have you been able to marry the both? Like, or is this just kind of an unfair label that some businesses are a lifestyle business?
Yeah, and I would say, and actually we share one investor, Jason Green from Emergence Capital, and a very experienced investor, obviously a very successful firm. They've backed both of us. But I also think some of the more, and he's also a more mature investor, and maybe also, frankly, that might be better, because if you're like a young first-time VC, they may believe that myth, I would say, that, hey, you just have to work 24/7. I did in my first company. But also, I think you lose a lot of energy, because when I was exhausted, yes, I was working more hours in my first company, but I was getting done a lot less per hour. And like I said, I think a lot of investors also see that. If you as a founder are in good shape, if you take care of yourself, you'll have more energy, you'll have more impact. And so although you may work less hours, you can actually build a more successful company. And then the other thing is, I think both Tony and I we're still very ambitious, because we both raised hundreds of millions of dollars. And we didn't do that by going to our investors and saying, I'm just going to build a middling company, lifestyle business, I'll only grow 10%, right? I think, and I'm not delivering on it now, but I'm like, hey, we'll double revenue, we'll grow at least 50% per year forever. Like I said, I'm not achieving it right now. But we still have the ambition to build global market leaders and to really win, but just do it in a different, more conscious way.
Yeah, and maybe a second-time founder, it gives you maybe a free ticket to do it your way, right?
True.
So that helped. But essentially, the way we designed it at Oyster is we baked the work style into the strategy. So we all heard culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So because with what we do, we offer global employment services where we enable businesses to be talent competitive around the world and take care of their team members in 150 countries. We have to succeed as a culture. We have to have a great culture so that we model the way for our customers. So in that case, it becomes part of the strategy, and this is my strategy to get away with this. But I do believe this is the future of work. I think today we have an increasing level of awareness when it comes to mental health, burnout in businesses. I mean, the world is going through tons of crises, and having a workforce that is more struggling with mental health because of work delivers lower productivity, lower engagement, lower retention, and therefore lower performance. So we are headed in a future of work where caring for how people feel working with you is going to be critical for success, and entrepreneurs who can master that will get an edge.
Yeah. And I will say, I think I like what you're saying, Tony, that culture, obviously, it's a very important positive differentiator, but I always put one slide in my investor deck, we call it our peak culture, and peak's also mnemonic, it stands for performance, entrepreneurship, authenticity, and kindness. And, but I try to keep investor decks short, I don't know, 12 slides at most, but one of those is on culture. And frankly, that's usually my closing slide. And I do find a lot of, and not every investor, but I think the kind of investors that I want to work with and the more forward-looking ones, they actually really appreciate that because they want to be part of a company they're proud of. You know, especially investors, once they've had some success like Jason, they also want to invest in companies that they do feel like are also making the world better and will give them a good return. So in some ways, I could say an investor will get even more excited because you can give them both, you know, culture, a company they're proud to be associated with, and you can be very ambitious and give them great returns. Then I think even the investor is going to like that pitch, that business more.
In choosing to sort of structure your business and your lives in this way, like, are you aware of kind of making any compromises in your businesses? Like, have you had to accept lower growth or like not be able to sort of launch a product on the timescale that you would have done in the past? Like, yeah.
Yeah, sure. I can give you a story. In Q3 2 years ago, we were lucky to have so much new business coming in that we didn't have enough capacity to service it. So we started seeing some sign of burnout in our people. People were like overworked. We stopped new business for a quarter. Of course, it hurt our top line results, maybe by 20, 30 percentage point in that year because there was so much demand for global hiring in that time. But we earned so much internal points with our team because we wanted to balance these three things. We wanted to balance the growth with our customer satisfaction and our team well-being. I call it the golden triangle of sustainable growth. And every quarter, you expand the surface area of that triangle. You add more capacity to grow, more capacity to improve your customer service, and you add more capacity to take care of your people. And it becomes a virtuous cycle of growth.
And I could never turn off new business for a quarter. But what I do in terms of compromise, like one conscious thought I have, like I will give up responsiveness. Like I almost never respond to Slacks in real time, for example. Because I also feel like how could I ever be conscious and present with anyone if I'm always like on my phone? So I'm consciously less responsive, you know, and sometimes I just won't respond Slacks, emails for some time. And like some part of me feels guilty about that because I'm like, oh, I should be responsive, I should be real time, but I just accept, hey, I'm not going to be responsive. And but that's important because I can be more present. And frankly, sometimes I'm not responsive because I might be doing a weekend of backcountry skiing, and that's okay, you know. So I'm definitely very willing to compromise on responsiveness, being less responsive. And then I also say, hey, maybe I get back to you 3 days later, but then it's a more thoughtful, better response. And but that's one thing I've thought about a lot is, you know, giving up responsiveness in order to have more energy, be more present, and be better.
Actually, it's interesting because we bake that into our operating model. Like we don't expect people to respond in real time. in the business. So we default this as asynchronous work. I have messages in my Slack, haven't responded them for 7 days, maybe 10 days. And I don't feel guilty at all. It's like we remove this feeling of guilt. If you think about it, like...
You really don't feel guilty? I still do.
I baked it into the business, you know, like it's like, so I think the key is to engineer a business where you reduce the amount of unnecessary emotional pressure that comes from work. I mean, there's some necessary pressure, but there's a lot of stuff that are unnecessary. I mean, think about commuting to the office. I mean, is that really necessary? I mean, how much pressure we are forced to do that, and in many businesses you don't need to do that to be productive. So, removing that pressure, removing like synchronous meetings from the business, you know, without any preparation. Like imagine you have no context of the meeting. You come in and you're reactive, you're angry, you're afraid, and like if you prepare in advance the meeting and provide asynchronous content to consume, and you do a bit of collaboration before, you come into the meeting prepared. You already have processed your emotions on your own, and you're not like snapping at people. So by creating this environment where you deliberately reduce the amount of unnecessary emotional stress on people, you make work support people's life, and not the other way around. Like life is already messy when it comes to our emotional stressors. Like why do you want to make work even more messy? You know? And that's what I call sustainable leadership. It's how do you create a system that sustains itself?
Godard, do you think there's maybe a sort of split between sort of the US and Europe in terms of this mindset or kind of the prioritization of sort of work-life balance? Or is that sort of also changing in Silicon Valley?
I think so, and I'm from Germany originally. Still have a German passport, so I've lived in Europe and in the US for many years. And I do think the American mindset does tend to be more just grind all the time. And even like the standard American vacation policy, you know, is like 2 weeks. Obviously, a lot of startups now, like G2, we do unlimited PTO, but I think there's still more reluctance in America to take time off, whereas Europe, you know, I think a lot of countries, like all of August is off, and I do really think that's a wonderful thing. So one thing we have instituted at G2, like company-wide, for example, you know, the Christmas, New Year's holiday period, like we just shut down, obviously except for critical customer support, and then we do the same thing, like in every region, but like in the US, July 4th week, we also do what we call aligned PTO, aligned holidays. Because I find for myself and probably for our teams, so there's like 1 week, almost 1 week in the summer, 1 week at the end of the year where everybody's off. I find that so much more refreshing for myself and I think for everybody because, and like you don't feel guilt, but that way there's no way to feel guilt, right? Because you know the whole company's off. And so we're aiming to do better, but I do still think in Europe there's more of a value on balance and family than there's in the US. You know, in all parts of the economy, I think, even including entrepreneurship.
Like, who knows how to take holiday the best in Europe? The French, right? So I hired my chief of staff French. So he's like the gatekeeper of my holiday. And vice versa, like I'm the gatekeeper of his holiday, and he just makes sure that he protects my holiday. Doesn't always work, unfortunately. Like I'm really striving to become more French when it comes to holiday, although I do hold a French passport. But it's, yeah, that's my secret, is Emmanuel.
I'm kind of curious, like, I think there's been a little bit of debate about this idea of startups where there's a chief of staff. Like, is this a multiplier? And sort of, does this unlock the potential of the founder? Or there's a sort of controversial point of view that this maybe indicates like the founders lack focus, who's not totally engaged in the business, and they're trying to deploy a proxy for themselves, and this adds to confusion and adds another layer of management. Like, what's your experience of that, Tony? And also, Godard, do you have your own chief of staff?
I do. Sinead, I don't know if she's here. She's here in Dublin. No, she's in the front row. But I love having a chief of staff. And because I do think it gives you a lot more leverage. And frankly, I also learned this from Mark Benioff, the founder and CEO of Salesforce. And frankly, he acquired our last startup, SteelBrick. So I didn't work directly for him, but I was always fascinated by him. Because obviously Mark not only runs Salesforce, but he also, now he owns Time Magazine, but he also has all these philanthropic interests. He has the UCSF Children's Hospitals, he's in the Enocean Initiatives, he also like invests in 100 companies, and I'm like, how does one human do all of this? and have so much impact. But he has, frankly, not just a chief of staff, he has a whole office of the chairman, CEO, obviously a much bigger company. So I think that scale of staff for me is not warranted. But I do have both a chief of staff, great executive assistant, Nikki, and I do think it gives you so much more leverage. And Sinead does a lot of strategic projects, like a lot of our most like cross-functional, because I think it's also where it's great to have a chief of staff, because some things you kind of have to own as CEO, because it's not just marketing, so CMO can't own, it's not just product. So she leads a lot of our cross-functional strategic initiatives and projects. And frankly, she also gives me leverage, like I just did a presentation. A lot of that was Sinead, but also she can be very strategic. She understands the whole business, the trends, so she can synthesize also for the board, right? So true strategic work. And so I think it gives you tremendous leverage. And frankly, there's no way, and a lot of things Sinead does better than I do anyway, so there's no way I could get as much done without her. And then also have an executive assistant. She actually tries to solve my responsiveness problem now, because I let her into my email, and sometimes she just responds for me, because that way I can be truly guilt-free. I can still be responsive, but she's responding for me. So I do think for any leader, and obviously early days, I will say G2, when I started, no, obviously I didn't have a chief of staff, didn't have an EA. Frankly, I was the accountant, like a lot of founders, right? Like when you're really small, like you do every job. But I think once you get to some scale, I love having a chief of staff, and I would recommend it to everyone.
I agree. I agree. It's actually is how do you create a super CEO? Is to kind of combine two minds that are complementary, and there are certain things that Emmanuel can do that I cannot do, and I don't want to do. It's like an area I don't want to develop in. It's not aligned with where I'm growing, and he loves it. It's his thing. So having that complementarity it creates like a super CEO, and makes you extremely productive, more scalable. But it's not only the chief of staff, it's like the configuration of your team, your C-suite. How do you create, like for me, it's how do I surround myself with people that can complement me? And eventually, I think we talked about it yesterday, it's like you want to be, indispensable. Like what needs to happen for you not to be needed for this business? How do you become like this gateway that channels the energy of the business through you and not because of you? And that's extremely powerful level of leadership. I find that is positive for the business.
Yeah. One other concept I've also learned from my conscious leadership coach is the idea of a zone of genius. And what is your zone of genius? And I think we all have one, whether we're a CEO, a journalist, like we all have, and I think you usually recognize your zone of genius when you're just kind of in ease and flow, and things are happening through you, it feels effortless, and you're making some unique contribution to the world. And the reality is, like most of the things that need to happen in the company probably aren't your zone of genius, like they aren't my zone of genius. And so then I think, like you said, building a whole team around you so you can bring your unique gifts. And for me, I do think like being here, hopefully like evangelizing G2 as a founder, like that's something I can uniquely do, where there's like tons of other things, like for example, doing our operating reviews, our V2 mom reviews, like I'm just hiring a new CFO, because I realized a lot of those things, like I can do them, but it's not my zone of genius. And frankly, my new CFO is probably going to do it better than I do. And so I think it's also, but it also then allows you to be more balanced, right? Because if all your work energy and activities are in your zone of genius, things you can uniquely do that are your unique gift to the world, and then all the other things, ideally, you delegate to someone else. And again, this all gets easier as you get bigger. And the other thing I will say, also, I'm inspired by Jeff Bezos. He may not be a work-life balance guy, I don't know, but he also says as CEO, you always want to be working 2 years in the future. And I like his quote. He's like, hey, the current quarter was baked 2 years ago. So he always wants to be working on what's happening in 2 years, right? But all the day-to-day operations, ideally, that's my goal as a founder CEO. I don't have to touch any of those. I don't have to do anything that affects the current quarter. And hopefully I'm doing inspirational, visionary things that'll help us in 2 years.
Very good. So you both have very consciously built businesses that are kind of untypical or kind of differ slightly from the kind of the mainstream. How have you communicated that to like your investors, your clients, and also your employees as well, or potential employees?
I just want to say first that this is the future of work. It might be atypical today, but I don't see a version of the future where we can continue taxing our mental health at work and burning out and hurting the planet. I think that this is the future of work that we're building here. And secondly is, first, I don't have to communicate it, right? If I'm not asked, that's kind of number one. I communicate my financial results. I communicate my strategy, how I'm going to win the category. By the way, we're leader in the G2 category. Thank you. But in our case, culture is a strategy, right? We are the best company in terms of culture in our category, and we're selling to HR people that cares about culture, that cares about treating people well, that cares about burnout prevention in the business. So it is a deliberate strategy to connect with the hearts and minds of our buyers. So this is how we communicate it.
Godard, what's your experience?
Yeah, well, everything Tony said resonated with me. Although, what was the original question? I'm sorry.
Oh, just how did you've chosen to build a new type of business, which has some boundaries, which has some limitations. How have you communicated that to your investors and to your clients and employees?
Right. And I did mention earlier it's part of every investor pitch, talking about our peak culture, our peak values. I also talk about it onboarding employees. I do an onboarding session with all our employees. And actually, I always tell this story. It's actually true. This was our second company, but the co-founders, we all sat down in my basement when we were starting the company. And we talked about both, because we actually decided we'd all work together. We kind of went into starting G2 more with, we weren't sure what we were going to build. But so before we even talked about the what, which turned into G2, the software marketplace, we said the how, which is the culture. And because a lot of us had felt burned out. We all worked together in my first company, but a lot of us were like, oh man, it did feel too hard. We were all burned out at the end of it. So I actually took about a year break before I started my next one, because I needed that much time to recover. And so we also said, hey, how do we build a culture that we love? So kind of starting selfishly. And then we did read this book by Chip Conley. It's a great book. It's actually called Peak, and how great companies find their mojo through Maslow. And he does talk about this triangle of alignment. And the triangle being, well, one, it does start with the customers, and how do you have evangelical customers? The employees, and how do you have inspired employees? And ultimately with investors also, he says, how do you also have proud investors? And I think the glue for that, he says, is a peak culture. And so we adopted that mnemonic, and we said, hey, we're going to build a peak culture. And so, but we communicate that, like I said, to our investors, to our employees, as well as our customers. And Tony is one of our customers. Thank you for all the great G2 reviews. But I also find we serve this ecosystem. And I do think in tech, and maybe we have the luxury, but I do also think most leaders in tech, they are also intrigued. How can they live more consciously? How can they have a more integrated, healthier life? And so we do also communicate it to our customers and to the world. And now I have a great Chief People Officer, Preeti, who really evangelizes this. And she actually was a conscious leadership coach before she joined us as Chief People Officer. And so it's very much part of our brand, our peak values, our peak culture. And I do believe it attracts employees, I believe it attracts investors, and I believe it attracts customers.
I mean, you become a talent magnet. I mean, we used to receive, when we were hiring a lot of people, like 13,000 job applications a month for a startup that is 15 months old, right? I mean, when you kind of open source that to the world, I mean, people want to work for companies that want to care for them, right? I also want to say that you also want to pick the right investors as well. You want to pick investors who are aligned with that view of the world, the future of work that is more sustainable. And we're lucky to have Jason Green in common. He believe in that. But I think part of your selection process of who you want to receive money from is to assess, all these investors, what drives them? Are they looking to only build a career and get a return, or they have a broader view on the world and they want to deliver impact in a similar way you want to deliver? So picking the right investor is important.
Very good. You're both serial founders who found great success, but can you maybe tell me, what are the sort of the habits or the routines or the rituals that have kind of been most impactful for you in terms of maintaining your work-life balance?
I'll start. First, I work flexibly, right? Which means that I have a lot of flexible time to think, let's say, pick up my children from school. I don't work in the morning, because I live in Cyprus, most of my team is in US time zone. So I tend to take care of myself, exercise, do my hobbies. And Friday is called Focus Friday, where we don't have internal meetings. So it's really the day to catch up on everything I need to catch up on during the week, so that I go into the weekend and I don't work in the weekend. So we spoke earlier about energy management, right? So it's time and energy management. You want to be at your peak energy when you're working. You want to be able to focus and balance and center to be able to deliver the best result you can. Yeah, I think these are like so I try to minimize my travel as well. It's not working much lately, but I try to be very extremist when I travel. Like I don't eat on planes. I have to exercise every day. I have to manage my sleep. I have to, meditate. So when I travel, it's like because I'm like off balance from my routine, I try to double down. I eat less and I kind of try to drive it further. Otherwise, I would kind of revert because I have all these stressors. And so really stress management becomes a higher priority for me when I travel.
Very good. Godard?
And I think one framework I think also Tony and I both like is called inner engineering. And inner engineering, very good book by Sadhguru. But he talks about how do you engineer yourself for physical, mental, and spiritual health. And but I do think for me it's daily discipline, the inner engineering, and some of this is harder when you travel. But like Tony, I still try to be disciplined when I'm traveling. But it does start with, good sleep, obviously drinking a lot of water, good nutrition, and for me also working out every day. And so I do, and even my EA schedules, I call it a peak physical spiritual hour. It's in my calendar every day. So that's kind of my absolute minimum, even when I'm traveling. Like this morning, actually, I found a local gym here, did an hour of spinning, stretching. And so even when I'm traveling, like I won't sacrifice that hour. And I do find that having that routine, and honestly, it sounds so basic, and people are always looking, I think, for a silver bullet for health, fitness, wellness, but I do think it's sleep, water, nutrition, working out, meditation. But doing those basics every day, I think that makes a huge difference for my energy, my well-being, and then I think it also helps my company because my employees feel it. And Tony and I also talked about this, because as a founder, a lot of ways you're the parent for your employees, and I also have 3 kids. But I think you determine the mood for the company, and you determine the energy. And so if you don't take care of yourself, and you're angry, you're tired, you're toxic, which I am at times still, I'm far from perfect, but if you show up energized, feeling healthy, you're uplifting, and the whole mood of the company is better.
Because people want to work for you then, become a talent magnet, right? Because if you care for yourself, then you expect people to care for themselves as well, right? And we, like, why would you force your CFO to interrupt their holiday and to answer an email? Like, why? Because I'm not going to interrupt my email to answer a non-urgent email from my CFO. So then suddenly you can have more talent attractiveness.
Very good. Well, I've learned a lot here, and I hope everyone else has. So maybe just say a round of applause for Tony and for Godard here.